Good evening, gentlemen. This is Jerome from CoachJerome.com, and this is Maximum Intensity Podcast number 2. Today's podcast is going to be called Biceps and Biomechanics. If you missed yesterday's podcast, I highly recommend going back and listening to it. It was about the importance of understanding and accepting your own mortality. It's a big belief of mine, and I really wanted to introduce this podcast with that particular topic. But again, today we're going to be talking about biceps and biomechanics, how you can not only build bigger arms, lifting and thinking more like an engineer, but how you can build those bigger, stronger arms in a lot safer of a manner, by the way. So that being said, let's suppose you have two individuals that are both capable of lifting the same amount of weight. Let's just hypothetically say you have a barbell bicep curl. Two guys can curl the same amount, but one of these two gentlemen has longer arms than the other one. Superficially, I suppose you could say that both individuals are equally strong in that particular exercise. Say they can curl a 100-pound barbell, a maximum of 10 repetitions. Well, if one of these gentlemen has longer arms, that actually changes the biomechanics a little bit. The gentleman with the longer arms actually has to move the weight through a longer range of movement and has to exert more force to lift that weight because of the increased length of the moment arm. So at least in one regard, the gentleman with the longer arms is actually a little bit stronger than the other gentleman. I do want to make a point to say that in a lot of ways it is pointless to compare your strength to another individual. The gym is a highly individualized thing. It's you versus you. I remember, back in high school, everybody wanted to be the first to put up 225. Then a little bit later, everyone wanted to be the first one to put up 315. But everybody's anatomy is a little bit unique. Every genetic trait is expressed along a continuum. You have, in regards to height, you have midgets on one end, you have giants on the other, and most people tend to fall somewhere in that middle of a spectrum. And most of these genetic continuums are expressed in kind of like a bell curve, if you remember that shape from middle school or high school, wherever you learned physics, statistics, things like that. So bell curve is very small on both opposite sides, and the middle kind of curves up like a bell shape, and that's where I believe about 75 to 80% of the people fall, is within that thick, meaty part of the bell curve. So again, in regards to height, you have midgets on one end, you have very average sized people constituting the majority of that bell curve, and then the other end you have giants. In regards to skin color, you have albinos on one end, you have most people with kind of a medium complexion, and then on the other end you have very, very dark skinned people. With hair, you have some people that have very, very straight hair on one end of the spectrum. Most people have a slight wave to it, and then you have very, very curly hair on the other end. So many of these genetic traits, most people tend to fall in the middle, but everybody has some variability to their genetics. So it can be fun to kind of compare your numbers to somebody else, especially if it motivates you and it makes you push harder in the gym. But your numbers ultimately don't matter to anybody else except for you. It's a you versus you game. In regards to biomechanics of bicep curls, I highly stress the importance of the fully contracted position. A muscle, let's not overcomplicate what a muscle is. A muscle has fixed attachment points in the body. It has an origination point, which is usually towards the center or the midline of the body, and then it has an insertion point. And the physiological, at least the primary physiological function of any given skeletal muscle is to contract between those 2 points. It's to bring those 2 points closer together. So one of the primary functions, not the primary function, but one of the primary functions of the bicep, due to where it attaches, is to basically contract the lower arm such that your palm essentially almost touches your shoulder. The primary function of the bicep is actually to supinate the wrist, or to turn the wrist palm side up. That's the primary function of the bicep, and this can be illustrated. So take your hand, palm down, and do a curling motion as if you're doing a bicep curl, but keep your palm facing down. Now, with your bicep fully contracted, turn your palm up, and you can see and you can feel how much that bicep muscle specifically contracts. I'm a big advocate of performing exercises in the fully contracted position for this reason. If you are not in the fully contracted position, you have muscle fibers that are not volitionally contracting against resistance. By having muscle fibers that aren't volitionally contracting against resistance, you have muscle fibers that are not being stressed by that particular exercise. Because of that, I think it's a big mistake to perform exercises in less than ideal biomechanics or body positioning. Performing a reverse curl or a palms down curl tends to accentuate the brachialis more so than the biceps. And the brachialis runs deeper than the bicep muscle. And some people think that it helps prop up the biceps a bit, but your brachialis will receive work if performing a standard dumbbell, barbell, cable, or like Nautilus or machine bicep curl. The brachialis is going to get work. I tend to think in a lot of ways exercise is greatly overcomplicated. People make things out to be harder than it really needs to be. If you're trying to build the best biceps that you can, your goal should be to perform the exercise that most directly stimulates that targeted muscle group. Perform that exercise with as much intensity as you can generate, and then go home, rest, recover, and let that muscle grow. Muscles don't actually grow in the gym. The gym is just to create the growth stimulus to get that set into motion, and then you go home, rest, recover, eat, and that's when the bicep grows. And the recovery process can take anywhere from about 48 hours to well over a week, again, depending on somebody's genetic capability. As a quick tangent, I had a client a couple years back that I trained out of my basement in my house. And this particular individual did not have the greatest recovery ability. So when we initially began, we did full body workouts 3 times a week. And after a while, he reached a plateau and he wouldn't get any stronger, he wouldn't get any bigger. We took that down to 2 days a week, and that worked really well for a while. And then eventually we took it down to 1 day a week. And near the end of our time together, this particular individual was only performing 6 total exercises every 10 to 14 days. And he was still getting bigger and stronger at that point. Your recovery ability is a genetically mediated trait. Some people can recover very quickly and have a larger capacity for tolerating exercise volume. Other individuals do not have the same recovery ability and need to perform fewer amounts of exercises and recover longer. However, back on track, while we all have unique genetics, and while some of us are more blessed and more gifted with bigger frames on which to build muscle, or more androgen receptors on our muscle to which we can utilize and absorb testosterone, or whether we have more nucleated muscle fibers, and my understanding, at least from last I read, is skeletal muscle. Most cells in your body have a nucleus. Not every skeletal muscle cell does, and the ones that do have nuclei, I hope I'm saying this correctly, either have more capacity for growth or are the ones that can actually volitionally contract. And again, this is genetically mediated traits. So all of us have a different genetic capability for which we can build muscle. But that being said, even though we all have different genetics, different capabilities for building muscle, different recovery ability, the same fundamental principles apply to every single human being. Even though we are all different genetically, we're all subject to the same laws of anatomy, physiology, and biology because we're all essentially 99.99% genetically identical. If we were all as different as the muscle magazines would have us believe, then doctors couldn't perform surgery, they couldn't diagnose illness, and they couldn't dispense medicine. To be a bit contrarian, when you get sick and you go to the doctor and they diagnose you with a certain condition or certain illness, they confirm it with blood work or some appropriate test, they have a very specific window of which they can prescribe a drug that can be used to treat this ailment. They not only know which drug will essentially work on the body, given the fact that you're a human being, but they also have very, very precise dosage amounts for most drugs. And again, we are a little bit differently genetically, so that some individuals may require a little bit more of a drug, some may require a little bit less. Some individuals tend to have more or fewer side effects on some drugs, but it doesn't change the fact that for 99% of the population, one single aspirin will take away a headache. If you're having, appendicitis, the doctors can go in and, not ever having met you before, not having performed any tests, they can perform an emergency surgery and save your life. And again, this is because we are all 99.99% genetically identical. So how does this relate to building muscle? Well, the same fundamental principles that apply to everybody in terms of anatomy, physiology, and biology are also understood in terms of what it takes to build muscle. And the muscle building, fat burning process is not that complicated. Exercise, at its core, the attempt to build muscle, at least for our purposes, I'll define exercise better in a later podcast. But in terms of building muscle, you have to provide the body with a sufficient stress such that the body views that stress as a threat to its survival. This particular stress and this drain on your recovery and your reserve ability elicits the compensatory response that is a increase in size and strength and muscle mass. When you perform a set of bicep curls, since we're talking bicep curls for this particular podcast, that set of bicep curls needs to be sufficiently intense that your body views it as a threat to your survival. Then by going home and recovering, resting, eating a balanced diet, nothing too complicated, the body compensates and overcompensates for that stress in case it's ever assaulted again by a similar stress. So the biggest issue most people have when they are trying to become a little bit stronger is they do not work out with sufficient intensity. As I previously alluded to, I am also a big advocate of the importance of the fully contracted position. So that we can be clear for the purposes of a bicep curl, the fully contracted position is with the arm fully contracted and the palm facing up, or in a supinated position. Most muscles should be worked from a position of full extension, to full contraction, with ideally maximum resistance in the fully contracted position. So let's suppose you asked a gym rat, bodybuilder, some fitness enthusiast, personal trainer, and you might want to try this sometime. Ask an individual what the single best bicep exercise is. If you were going to build bigger, stronger biceps, what's the best exercise? And I think what you're likely to find is most individuals will answer that the barbell bicep curl is the best exercise. And I want to take a few minutes and really analyze that particular movement and why I believe it's not the best movement, and then counter that with my opinion of what I view as the single best bicep exercise. So for our purposes, let's say you are going to perform a standing barbell bicep curl. When you are holding the weight with the biceps fully extended, fully relaxed, the weight is essentially hanging straight down. The thing about free weights is gravity only pulls in one direction, at least, primarily given the mass of the earth, but the weight is only being pulled straight down. So at the beginning of the range of movement, when the biceps are fully relaxed and the weight is hanging straight down, there is zero tension on the biceps. All of that weight is being supported by the skeleton of the arm, and the weight is pulling straight down, and the muscles are not contracting against resistance. Our elbows essentially are hinges, but for the arm to move, it has to move through a semicircular position. It has to complete basically a half of a circle arc through this hinge that is the elbow. Because of this, you have two vectors at play. You have one in the x-coordinate and you have one in the y-coordinate. The initial movement at the beginning of a bicep curl is not up. It's essentially out, that is away from the body. In contracting the biceps and moving the weight away from the body, there is very little tension directly on the biceps because, again, the force of the weight only pulls straight down, but to initiate that movement, the weight is essentially being pushed or pulled, depending on your point of view, away from the body. You actually have the most resistance with a bicep curl when your arms are forming a 90-degree angle, when that weight is being held perfectly parallel with the floor. Only then do you have the maximum amount of resistance in that position. However, the biceps are only approximately 50% contracted. As you lift from that halfway point where the exercise is most difficult, the weight is not being lifted directly vertically, but instead, to some degree, is being pulled towards the shoulder, or towards the body. Because there is no resistance in this one particular plane of movement that is towards the body or away from the body in the lower half of the range of movement, the amount of physical work that is being performed by the biceps, the tension that is on the muscle, is actually reducing as you continue to lift. Then when you finally reach the fully contracted position of the biceps, let's assume that your elbow and your wrist are straight up and down as they should be in that particular part of the movement. You have now returned to a position of literally zero resistance of the biceps against that weight. The biceps are not forcibly contracting against the weight, and the weight is being fully supported by the bones in the arm, through the bones of the arm, as that weight is being held straight up and down. So a barbell bicep curl starts off, there's no tension on the biceps. Halfway through the range of movement, where only approximately half of the muscle is contracting, the movement is actually the most difficult. And then at the top of the range of movement, when the biceps are fully contracting, there's essentially no resistance on the biceps in the fully contracted position. The weight is slowly lowered, and this particular movement is repeated until the individual terminates a set. So that's a set of standing barbell bicep curls. While it can be effective, while any exercise can be effective performed with sufficient intensity and progression over time, it is not the ideal bicep exercise. The ideal bicep exercise will be a good Nautilus or Hammer brand bicep curl machine. So that being said, let's analyze a movement, and maybe it'll be easier if I'll talk first about having a circular pulley system. Most machines have circular pulleys, so being on a machine, the actual angle of your bicep doesn't, the actual angle of your arm, I should say, doesn't really matter because the pulley can change the direction of the resistance. The other advantage to a pulley is you have perfectly even resistance throughout the entire range of movement. Because of this ensures that you have at least some degree of resistance with the muscle in the fully contracted position. The exercise is going to be harder initially than it would be with a barbell, again, because you have resistance to where you would not have had resistance in a free weight exercise. Halfway through in the range of movement, you have the same amount of resistance, and then when the muscle is in the fully contracted position, you have that same amount of resistance. So at least having a circular pulley is in a lot of ways advantageous to a free weight barbell exercise. However, Nautilus brands, the reason the company is called Nautilus is because most of their machines, at least originally, I can't vouch for most of their machines now, but originally the Nautilus used a cam type pulley instead of a circular pulley. And the idea of the cam was that the exercise would be essentially very easy initially, and then as the rope or chain or belt went around the pulley as you perform the exercise, the diameter of that cam increased such that more force was required to continue to lift the same amount of weight throughout the range of movement. Now, these original cams were designed such that they could match the strength curve of a particular muscle. Muscles have what are called ascending or descending strength curves. And I do think there is some error in their interpretation in a lot of ways, but for our purposes of this podcast today, what you need to know is muscles are stronger as they get closer to their fully contracted position. And this makes sense because you have more muscle fibers in that targeted muscle group that are contracting against resistance. So the Nautilus cam at the beginning of a range of movement would have a very small diameter, or radius to that cam, and then as you would continue to lift, the diameter of the cam would increase to match the strength curve of the muscle until you would have maximum resistance in the fully contracted position. So these Nautilus cams were kind of shaped like a seashell. Again, that's why it's called Nautilus. It's an increasing radius, kind of oblong shape. So what's the advantage of this? Well, you always have tension on the specific muscle group. You have maximum resistance in the fully contracted position. And one thing that's really advantageous too, that some bicep machines have that others don't, and most Nautilus machines have this, is given the direction of resistance, some bicep machines will provide resistance in the fully contracted position, regardless of whether it's a cam or a circular pulley, and others won't. A good bicep machine, when you are in the fully contracted position, will be pulling in the direction to where your hand is being pulled away from your shoulder. Not straight down, not up, but away from the shoulder, given the body positioning of that particular machine. Again, this allows for a maximum amount of resistance in the fully contracted position, where you have the most muscle fiber volitionally or voluntarily contracting against that resistance. So the best exercise is not a barbell bicep curl. It's actually a Nautilus bicep machine, or a hammer strength bicep machine. Hammer exercise company, I believe, was founded by Arthur Jones's son. Arthur Jones is the founder of Nautilus. I believe his son founded Hammer. And most hammer machines, instead of being plate loaded to be able to lift weights, you tend to pile different plates onto, different weight barbell plates onto, that you can, with most of the machines, get quite a bit of weight on particular exercises. So both of those, I believe, generally use the cam, and the cam is a fantastic engineering feat that is way, way, way underappreciated. So if anyone tells you that machines are for beginners, it's a total myth. Good machines are the most intelligent selection that you can make for a particular exercise, at least with our purposes with biceps. And I'll break down other machines in future podcasts. But free weights or more athletic movements are not for the intermediate or advanced, with machines being for beginners. Even the idea that these machines are for the more advanced isn't necessarily true either. It's your execution that is going to get you the best degree of results, regardless of whether you use a free weight exercise or a machine, even if it's a really good machine. The other aspect of biomechanics that I really want to talk about before we wind down this podcast today is the importance of lifting slowly. And this is something that you kind of hear when you're new to exercising, but isn't always followed through upon to the best degree. So many of us were taught early on that you should be able to stop the weight at any given point in the range of movement. And if you can't, then you're moving too fast. At least I heard that when I began lifting, and it's something that I followed for a bit. But you watch YouTube, you watch some bodybuilders, some athletes, some gym rats train. What do? They throw the weights around. Just because some meathead is training a certain way doesn't mean it's how you should train. There is a good-looking physique that preaches every single type of training theory. There is a good-looking physique that preaches every diet theory out there. You need to judge an individual not based on their physique, but is what they're saying logical? Is it non-contradictory? And is it congruent with the known laws of biology, anatomy, physiology, and for our purposes, biomechanics? So why do I say lift slowly? Well, let me first say that let's just assume, hypothetically, most individuals lift with a 1 second lifting, or concentric, and a 1 second lowering, or eccentric, portion of the range of movement. 1 second up, 1 second down. Now let's say I'm a high intensity trainer. I advocate for most exercises approximately a 4-second lifting and a 4-second lowering. And if you have a part of this exercise that is in the fully contracted position, you want to flex really, really hard. You want to flex that muscle in that fully contracted position against direct resistance for approximately 2 seconds. So most people lift with a 1-1 cadence. For any applicable exercises, I recommend a 4-2-4 cadence, 4-second lift, 2-second isometric flex, and a 4-second lowering period. Otherwise, if you do not have maximum resistance in the fully contracted position, I recommend 4-second lifting, 4-second lowering. So let's go back to high school physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. Acceleration is speed divided by time. Speed is distance divided by time. So force, the longer formula for force, would be mass times speed divided by time squared, or mass times velocity divided by time squared. So let's use a hypothetical exercise, a dumbbell shoulder press. Let's suppose that you could lift a 100-pound weight when you're seated straight up while you're seated straight up. Let's suppose you could shoulder press or overhead press a 100-pound weight. You're moving this weight approximately 2 feet. And let's just say you lift this weight over 1 second. You could figure out the total force that is being applied to lift that weight. And that force is being generated by the body, and that force is also being applied to the particular joints. Again, based on body positioning and biomechanics, we could figure out the amount of force that's being applied on each joint, but for our purposes, let's just say you can figure out the total amount of force. If you lift a 100-pound weight, 2 feet, with a 1 second up, 1 second down cadence, you can generate that, or you can calculate that force. Now, suppose you lifted that same weight, but you lifted 4 seconds up, 4 seconds down. Well, the mass, the weight, doesn't change. You're still lifting a 100-pound weight. The distance that you're lifting it, approximately 2 feet, doesn't change because you're performing the same exercise. But let's say that you lift over 4 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now what happens is, because that time component is in the denominator of that fraction, and the time component is squared, the total amount of force that is being applied by the body and to the body is drastically reduced. Now, you will have to perform the same amount of mechanical work. Mechanical work is just defined as weight divided by distance. So you're lifting a 100-pound weight directly overhead 2 feet. You perform a certain amount of mechanical work, but the actual force that's being applied, and I'm thinking more directly to the joints here than the force that the muscles are generating, because that time component is squared and all the other variables are exactly the same. 4 seconds times 4 seconds is 16. So you have 1/16 the net force on the body. And I want you to really think about that. 1/16 the impact and the stress on the body by moving the same amount of weight. The purpose of weight training is to not generate the maximum amount of force possible. The purpose of weight training is to stress and fatigue the muscles of the body such that you elicit the compensatory response, that is the buildup of additional muscle mass. And there are also tangential benefits of exercise like metabolic conditioning, increasing flexibility, and aesthetic changes, more muscle, less fat. But the purpose of your weight training is not to generate as much force as possible. It's not what your muscles can do to the weights. It's what the weights can do for your muscles. So your job when you go into the gym is not to see how much weight you can lift. It's not to see how fast you can lift. It's not to see how coordinated and athletic movement you can perform. Your job when you go to the gym is to perform the precise amount necessary of very specific targeted exercises in a manner that sufficiently stresses the body such that you build stronger, bigger muscles. And that's it. And the last idea that I would like to mention with biomechanics and biceps, And this is an idea that I haven't really seen any literature on. I haven't seen anyone even really talk about it, but it's just something worth considering. And that's the idea of synergy. The idea of synergy in most mediums is that essentially 2 plus 2 equals 5. The end result is greater than the sum of the parts. In terms of building muscle, consider the following. If you were to curl a 100-pound barbell for your biceps, seeing as that's the exercise that we've been speaking most deliberately, most specifically about during this podcast. If you could perform a 100-pound bicep curl, a maximum of 10 repetitions, you would think and you would suspect that you could take a 50-pound dumbbell in each arm and perform 10 curls as well. But that's really not the case. You're not nearly as strong working unilaterally or independently with each joint as you are collectively as a whole. Now the movement, biomechanically, the movement could be identical. You could hold a 50-pound dumbbell in each arm, the supinated grip, the same way that you would a barbell, and you could perform that movement, even moving both arms at the same time. But there is something that I don't know that allows you to be stronger when you're performing two-handed movements at the same time, when you're training bilaterally compared to unilaterally. And I suspect, and again, there's not really any science or literature about this, but I would suspect that if you were capable of handling more weight for the same number of repetitions, you would elicit a larger growth response. And that factors into other things like recovery with your workouts as well. But we'll talk about recovery in another episode. So synergy. I would believe it'd be preferential, instead of doing exercises like alternating dumbbell curls, to instead focus on exercises that use both arms at the same time. I don't know the method of action of why you're stronger with synergy. I suspect that the larger stress on the body becomes more efficient at, immobilizing certain pathways and cellular metabolism. I don't know exactly. But nevertheless, I suppose in one regard, it doesn't even matter. If you are stronger on a bilateral movement, it only makes sense to use a bilateral movement over a unilateral movement. So, to recap this episode, train intelligently. Pick exercises that are bilateral, not unilateral. Lift slowly. Try and have maximum resistance in the fully contracted position. And if you have access to something like a circular pulley or a cam that can directly target that exercise, you're going to get better results in less time. Again, your job when you enter the gym is not to just see how much work you can mindlessly endure, but to perform a precise and specific amount and a precise and specific targeted exercise for any given muscle group that you plan on working, and then get the hell out of the gym, go home, rest, recover, and grow. All right, guys, that does it for episode 2, Biceps and Biomechanics. Thanks for listening. I will talk to you next time.